Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So we're going to go through a few different indicators here. One of the things that we talked about a few months ago was this idea of seeing price action sort of fade into the summer. And there were definitely several pieces of evidence that helped us come to such a conclusion. First of all, we noted simply the most simplest one. We just said, guys, look, last year around this time, this is what happened, right? I mean, we rallied up into April and then we just faded for the next several months. And we didn't really pick back up at all until June. And then that was faded until the fourth quarter. So we said, all right, well, if this can happen here, why can't it happen here? Pretty hand wavy. I get it. But that is one of the things that we spoke about. The other thing that I mentioned that's something to look for, especially during such a heated time going into the halving, we said, well, what if this plays out similar to what ETH did going into the merge, right? Kind of a similar type of thing in terms of it being a big narrative and everyone's talking about it. And sure enough, that's essentially what happened, because if you go look, right, if you actually go look at what ETH did going into the merge, it had a high 1 month before the merge, and then on the day of the merge, it put in a lower high. So basically, people front ran it a month beforehand, and then on the actual day of the merge, it was a lower high by ETH USD, and then ETH ended up actually dropping from that local high all the way down about almost 50% before it started to pick back up again. Now, you guys know my opinion on ETH. I've been very clear about it for a long time, and that has just been that, I think for things like ETH, that's stuff that generally is going to come later in the cycle after a Fed pivot, after QE. Up until that point, the general expectation is that ETH will bleed to Bitcoin. And it's been a very contentious view. I hope that by this point in the cycle, you can at least appreciate where I was coming from. Even if you disagreed with me, whatever. And even if you think it's already bottomed, I at least hope that by this point in the cycle, you can say, all right, like, I get why he said it. And even recently, there's plenty of evidence, right? Look at this. Look at ETH USD. It's back to where it was in late February. It's 2,900 today. It was also 2,900 in late February. If you overlay Bitcoin USD, you'll see that Bitcoin in late February was all the way down at 50K. And right now it's at 60K. So this is the reason why I talk about that stuff. It's the reason why I talk about Bitcoin dominance and all that stuff is because, if you hold a lot of these other cryptocurrencies, not all, but if you hold most of them, they're going to bleed back to Bitcoin during this phase of the market cycle. And so I think that's been proven at this point. Again, there are some that have outperformed, but we always said there would be a few, but that the general trend should remain intact. And so when you look back at what Bitcoin has really been doing recently, it makes you wonder, well, is it similar to what ETH did going into the merge? Because, Bitcoin also put in a lower high in April, right? I mean, and we talked about this idea actually even back in March, that this was a potential outcome if it wants to follow ETH USD. And that would basically be to put a high in 1 month before the merge. And then you're essentially putting in a 1 month before the halving. And then you're putting in a lower high on the day of the halving. Very similar as to what ETH USD did, way back when. Obviously, the phase of the cycle was completely different. 2022 was obviously a bear market year, but you can kind of see that same idea, right? You get a rally before a major event. It tops out 1 month before the event, so that by the time the people come in to buy the actual event, they're basically buying to the people who bought earlier, and now they're left with the bags, right? So that played out, right? That outcome is what happened. And now I want to talk about where are we now? And, is it going to play out like this? Is it going to play out like 2019? And, I've talked about this a lot, and I've said that, there's pieces of evidence to support both views in terms of what this rally is ultimately going to be. And it has elements of both. It really does. I mean, again, like it has had elements of both. And I think that any objective person would say that there's elements of it being the 2019 rally because it was a Bitcoin dominance. It was a Bitcoin dominance rally, right? Where Bitcoin went up, but most altcoins bled back to it. But it was somewhat similar to this one as well because we actually put in new all-time highs, right? That was not something that Bitcoin did in 2019. It was not something that Bitcoin did in 2019. And so we said, all right, well, it's sort of a combination of these two rallies that we saw previously, where in the 2019 rally, you saw ETH Bitcoin fade. And guys, a lot of people talk, whenever I talk about ETH, they're like, why are you such a hater on ETH? Guys, if I talk about it, it's because I like it. I can have an objective outlook on the ETH Bitcoin valuation, and I can think it's going down, but that doesn't mean that long-term I don't like ETH. In the same way, at some point, I will be bullish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation, and that doesn't mean I don't like Bitcoin. It's just, this is how the market works. If you're still struggling with this 2019 sort of comparison, there are a couple of examples to look towards. And again, it doesn't have to play out like 2019, but I want to go through the evidence, and then we can also talk about the evidence of what if it just does something like this. So one thing to consider is the fear and greed index, okay? So if you look at the fear and greed index, and we talked about this when it happened, if you isolate just the 90 to 100, you'll see that it's occurred 3 times. 2019, 2020 and 2021, and 2024. You see that? So, and we talked about this on the day. We said, guys, there's a chance that it's just like 2019 where you just go into the extreme greed for just 1 or 2 days, and then that's it, and then the market just fades, rather than doing something like this where it just stays in extreme greed for a long time. So that type of data point more so has 2019 written all over it, right? It wasn't a durable, extreme greed phase in the 90s like it was in late 2020 and early 2021. And again, why should it be? This is not a QE rally where the money printer's on. This is the QT rally where a lot of the fuel for Bitcoin has been people converting their alts to Bitcoin. Now, some of the fuel has obviously come from ETFs and from people who just regularly DCA Bitcoin, but there's no denying that a significant contribution has come from people converting their ETH to Bitcoin or their alts to Bitcoin. It's clear that that's the case, and it's taken obviously some people a lot longer to recognize this than others. I tried to tell everyone when ETH Bitcoin was back above 0.08 that, that was the time to really pivot your outlook on ETH and basically go Bitcoin heavy until the Fed pivots. And, I think some people are finally getting the memo, but it's already almost 50% down. At this point, I don't even know. It's just really late is the point, right? I still do expect the ETH Bitcoin valuation to go down, but if at this point you're finally recognizing it, at this point, it could be worthwhile to say, all right, well, next cycle, right? That's your tuition for the cycle. The next cycle, you'll know, right? Rather than make a rash decision, because, I'd hate for someone to basically, because what's going to end up happening with some people is they're going to watch this entire downtrend. They're going to finally get the memo, and then they're going to convert, and then it's going to be the bottom, right? So you have to be careful, especially this long into a downtrend. But there's definitely evidence, right? You can look at the fear and greed index and say, well, it went into extreme greed, but it only really stayed there for a day or two, right? Only really one day. Here it was 2 days, and that was it. Not like what we saw over here, but it was similar to 2020 and 2021 in the sense that we hit new highs. And so one of the things I said to be on the lookout for as Bitcoin fades into April and into May, as we get into the summer, one thing I said was watch what ETH Bitcoin does, and that should provide some guidance as to whether it's more 2019-esque or 2020, 2021-esque. And I was very clear that my opinion was that it was more like 2019 in the sense of if you only are picking between these two. Now, there's a chance it's just more similar to this, where we just basically, go down for a bit, then we pop up for a couple weeks, and then we go down for a bit more, and then maybe pick up at the end of the year. But there's also a chance that it is sort of like a 2019-esque move, and I want to go through what something like that would look like. And again, if you're struggling with this comparison, because I get it, everyone's like, why compare it to 2019? This is a halving year, right? Compare it to the halving years. Don't compare it to the pre-halving years. But the reason I make this comparison is because I think, and it should be evident at this point to everyone, especially everyone who faded the entire Bitcoin dominance rally so far, that monetary policy does play a role. And if you were to overlay Bitcoin dominance onto the chart, for everyone that said that dominance topped last year or in January, right? I mean, people have been calling the top on it for the entire rally. And most people on crypto Twitter have just been fading the entire Bitcoin dominance rally. And every time they tweet about it, they say that that's the top. And then altcoins are going to do well, and then they just end up calling the top again a few months later. But the point with Bitcoin, with Bitcoin dominance and everything is that we know that last cycle dominance did not top until two things. First, the Fed had lowered rates, and that has not happened yet. So again, I think people keep trying to front run it, but until the Fed actually lowers rates, why should the outcome be any different? Everyone who has called the top on Bitcoin dominance for the last several years based on, this is what it did last cycle, or this is the timing of it last cycle, or they said, all right, well, the stablecoin market makes up a huge percent now, so it won't go as high. They were all wrong. They were all wrong, right? I mean, they were wrong. And so it should be evident that it is dependent on monetary policy. It is. Whether people, and I've seen some people say, crypto is a new asset class, and so it's not subject to the same, sort of the monetary policy stuff in the same way that other asset classes are. But it is. You can see that higher risk assets in general are bleeding to lower risk assets, just like the Russell's bleeding to the NASDAQ, right? Just like silver is bleeding to gold. It's the same thing across asset classes. And so we know that dominance did not top until after the Fed cut rates. And we know that it topped when the Fed turned the money printer back on, right? So that's evidence there to suggest, guys, there's a reason why it might make sense to say, what if this is like 2019 and not 2020? Because there is a good chance that the Fed will cut at some point this year. Now, I don't know when it's going to be. Obviously, the next meeting is in June, but I would guess they're going to cut sometime this year. Probably before the election. Okay, I actually think they're going to cut this summer, but my conviction on that at the current time is not like that high. I would say maybe 65% chance we get a cut this summer. Actually, if you include September in that, I'd probably say like a 90% chance. If you're just talking about June, July, then I might just say like a 65% chance. I think there's a higher chance they cut this summer than the market's actually currently pricing in. So when I look at this, I say, guys, I think there is a reason to compare it to 2019. If I still haven't sold you on this, I want to talk about two other things. One of which is to go look at year-to-date ROI, right? And we're not going to look at Bitcoin. we're going to look at ETH Bitcoin. And it's going to, I feel like, tell a fairly compelling picture. Now look at it in 2024, and now look at it in 2019. It's pretty similar, right? Now, if you wanted to compare 2024 ETH Bitcoin to 2020, you can do that, but it looks completely different, right? 2020 ETH Bitcoin was in an uptrend. 2024 ETH Bitcoin is in a downtrend. 2016 ETH Bitcoin had gone up massively at this point, right? So when you think about halving years and you say, well, why do you keep comparing it to 2019? It has nothing to do with the halving year, right? It just has to do with monetary policy and rate cuts and QE. That's what drives the markets. That is what's more important, I think, okay? And, at some point, at some point you're either going to buy it or you're not, right? And even though ETH Bitcoin has been following along so far, it doesn't mean it's going to continue. But if you were to look at when the Fed cut rates on this chart, they cut right here, okay, right here, right before it had another leg down, and then QE started right here where ETH Bitcoin bottomed, okay? So I feel like we can kind of look at this chart and be like, all right, well, if the Fed cuts this year and then we switch over to QE at some point, maybe it is worthwhile to think about it in terms of a 2019-esque local top, mid-cycle top, whatever you want to call it, right? I don't really care what you want to call it. We assign these names to it, although I think it's largely just us trying to make ourselves feel better. Again, you can call it what you want, but this is the reason why, right? You can look at fear and greed and say, all right, it was kind of similar to 2019. You can look at ETH Bitcoin and say, all right, it's kind of similar to 2019. You can also look at gold. And gold is another example that I think you can say, all right, it's kind of similar. It's kind of similar to 2019. And when you look at gold and where I'm coming from why I'm bringing that up, in last cycle, gold broke out in June of 2019. And what was fascinating about that breakout is that actually marked the top for Bitcoin, and that top lasted for actually more than a year, right? That doesn't mean that the current one has to, but this is something I said to be on the lookout for. This is not, and by the way, if you're tuning in for the first time, you're like, well, this was great. Too bad we didn't have it in hindsight. Guys, this is all I talked about for months, right? Going into it was gold's breaking out in March. ETH Bitcoin is breaking down in March, and therefore, you might see something like this going into the summer where Bitcoin kind of just fades for a while. And this is what we saw, right? If you were to overlay Bitcoin USD onto this chart, you'll see pretty clearly that when gold broke out in 2019, that's where Bitcoin found a local top. And then right here, it broke out in 2024. And wouldn't you know, Bitcoin found a local top. So, I look at those things. I'm like, well, why can't it be? Why can't it be somewhat similar to 2019? Because you have the year-to-date ROI of ETH Bitcoin following 2019. You have gold breaking out similar to 2019. You have the Fear and Greed Index, very similar to 2019. Why not, right? Why not? And then the question becomes, well, okay, we can buy, let's say we can buy it to 2019-esque, but what does that mean, right? Because it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to play out the exact same way from here, but if it were to play out in a similar way, then what would we expect? What would we expect? Well, essentially what happened last time is that Bitcoin faded very slowly to the bull market support band. And while it faded, it occasionally had bounces up to the 8-week moving average, okay? So if I were to show you the 8-week moving average, we're to zoom in over here, you can see that essentially what happened is Bitcoin faded very slowly and got to the 8-week, popped back above it, sort of slowly faded to the bull market support band, and then by September, it broke down. But what you'll notice is that it didn't just go straight down, right? It had some pretty impressive rallies. This rally right here in July corresponded to the first rate cut, right? If you overlay interest rates onto the chart, you will see that that was when the Fed cut rates. The Fed cut rates, and then Bitcoin USD rallied for 2 weeks. Do you guys remember how I said that ETH Bitcoin goes down no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD? This is ultimately Bitcoin USD going down, but you still had some counter trend rallies. Look at July 29th and go to year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in 2019. Do you know when Bitcoin rallied at the first rate cut? That was what caused this leg down by ETH Bitcoin right here. So ETH Bitcoin actually bottomed before Bitcoin broke down below its bull market support band. That doesn't mean that it has to play out like that this time. But what I'm saying is that if it were to play out like that this time, then there's a chance that ETH Bitcoin could bottom before Bitcoin even falls below the bull market support band. And then we have to think, well, why would that be? Like, what could possibly cause something like that to happen? You would think, well, if Bitcoin falls below it, then, alts get crushed more. But the reality is actually that alts get crushed on their Bitcoin pairs up here, and then they go up against Bitcoin down here. But because Bitcoin's going down, alts are also going down, right? It's actually really, it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, if you look at like the Russell against the NASDAQ, go back to the bear market year of 2022, right? In the bear market year, the Russell outperformed the NASDAQ, but the Russell still went down. Last cycle, when Bitcoin dominance topped in September, and then Bitcoin started going down, while alt Bitcoin pairs were going up, guess what? Total 3 was going down, even though Bitcoin dominance had topped. So that would be the next phase of the cycle if it were to play out like 2019. But we're not even there yet, right? I mean, we're still up in this range because Bitcoin hasn't fallen below the bull market support band, and I don't know when it's going to. And there's a chance it might not anytime soon, right? I mean, I do think it probably will. But again, if you go back and look at what happened last cycle, it just bled into it, and then it popped up, and then it finally fell below it a couple months later. So one thing though to consider is when it had this move, there was one key thing that hadn't happened yet, right? ETH Bitcoin hadn't broken down, right? If you overlay ETH Bitcoin, it hadn't broken down below this low from way over here, right? ETH Bitcoin was still way up here. So you could argue that there was sufficient liquidity in the altcoin market that kept Bitcoin afloat, right? You can make that argument. The issue now, of course, is that ETH Bitcoin has broken down. And when Bitcoin faded to the bull market support band in 2019, it lost support after ETH Bitcoin had bottomed. And I think the reason that makes sense is because once liquidity has been sucked dry from the altcoin market, then Bitcoin sort of loses a source of its, of what's keeping it going up, right? And then Bitcoin goes down. And then you get into the phase of the cycle where alt Bitcoin pairs go up, but alt USD pairs go down if we were to play out like 2019. Again, we're not there right now. And honestly, there's also a decent chance that even if we were to go into a phase like that, it would still be several weeks of Bitcoin chopping around, potentially getting a little bit of a rally after the Fed cuts rates. It's a long process. I mean, this process right here lasted from June until January, and that was completely before the whole pandemic happened. I mean, that was half a year of basically just a slow bleed, but you had a lot of rallies, right? So again, I think the question is really, is it like 2019 or is it like 2023? Again, because ETH Bitcoin is broken down and because gold is broken out, and it really does seem like the Fear and Greed Index and the year-to-date ROI of ETH Bitcoin is following 2019. I would still err on the side of 2019, but I still think it might be a mistake to just say it has to play out like that because markets are always evolving. It's not like every single cycle is going to be completely the same. We did hit new all-time highs. We also have spot ETFs, etc. But I do think it's at least worthwhile to be prepared for that outcome. And one of the things that I said previously is that, a lot of times when you get close to the bull market square pen, you get a bounce back up to the 8-week SMA, right? That's exactly what happened, right? We hit it and we bounced right back up to the 8-week SMA, and then we keep on fading. It's the same thing that happened in 2019, right? You get close to that bull market square pen, you bounce back up to the 8-week, and then you still fade for a little bit. So, I don't know, honestly, exactly if it's going to play out like 2019, but if I had to pick one point out of all prior cycles where I think this is the most similar to, I would say like 2019, because I think the Fed's going to cut rates this year, and I think it's based on monetary policy. And I think that when the Fed does cut rates, that's going to take away some of the bid for Bitcoin. Maybe like, what's he talking about? What's he talking about? Why would it take away? I mean, lower rates are good, right? But I think the reason why it could take away some of the bid for Bitcoin relatively is because when looser monetary policy arrives, the people that were basically Bitcoin only for so long, then they start to convert into higher risk stuff like altcoins. Because they're like, all right, well, now you got the money printer back on. Let's see what the altcoin market can do. I think the biggest mistake that a lot of people have made this cycle is just constantly thinking it's alt season. If you were to look at the altcoin market on their Bitcoin pairs, this is total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. There's one easy way to look at this chart, and that's to just simply look at yearly candles. And they tell a fairly compelling story, right? You don't need me to explain this, right? It's just one green candle and then 3 red, right? So you get 3 candles, 3 years where alts bleed to Bitcoin. And then you get 1 year where they go up. This is alt season, right? 2017 was alt season. 2021 was alt season. But these 3 years in between are people prematurely calling alt season every month and calling the top on Bitcoin dominance every month because they want it to be alt season again. But in reality, this alt season occurred in 2021 after the Fed had already lowered rates and after the Fed had shifted monetary policy back to QE, away from quantitative tightening. So I think it has been a mistake for so many people to keep front running this theoretical alt season because they think that it has to come because Bitcoin, had a great rally, and therefore people think that they're going to then rotate all their Bitcoin into the altcoin market, right? But that's not always how it works, right? In 2019, people did not rotate out of Bitcoin. They still stuck with it, even though Bitcoin rallied, over 300%, right? And you might say, well, ETH is up a lot, right? ETH's up a decent amount here. But if you think about it, is it compared to 2019? Is it different? And I don't know. You look at this rally and you're like, well, that's 300% rally. Okay, what was this one? Let's go take a look. Oh, it was also about 350%. I think the reason why it looks different is because this time it was a lot closer to the highs, but it's still the same percent, approximately. And you're seeing ETH USD fade here with Bitcoin still at 60K, right? As I showed earlier. The problem is that ETH is already at 2,900 despite the fact that Bitcoin's at 60K. The last time ETH was at 2,900, Bitcoin was at 50K. So what happens if Bitcoin goes to 50K? Then where does ETH go? Probably down to like 2K or something. And 2,000 divided by 50 is 0.04, right? That would be the ETH Bitcoin valuation of 0.04. So, there's just a lot to think about, right? And again, I'm not saying that anything, even if it is 2019-esque, I'm not saying it all plays out immediately. This was a long grind, right? It took like 6 months to play out. So, and by the way, back then, you also had a very similar round number that we were trying to everyone thought was going to hold, right? A lot of people thought was going to hold. And that was 10K, And you can see that we occasionally went below 10K, but every time we went below it for the first, let's call it 2 months, we then got back above it, right? So they were all fake outs, and everyone every time we got it below it, everyone's like, all right, time to buy the dip. We then rallied, but then every rally ended up being a lower high. So be on the lookout. Again, I'm not saying it has to play out. Be on the lookout, though, because if you look at 60K, right? So far, every time we go below it, right, you're seeing these bounces come back up. But if it does rally back up, right, if Bitcoin does get some type of a bounce, off its bull market support band, off the 8-week SMA, the key thing to look for is, where does Bitcoin dominance go, right? Where does it go? And if you see a bounce here, back up to the 8-week SMA again, that's the thing, right, that keeps on making things like ETH Bitcoin bleed. Because the bid just is not there for ETH right now in the same way that it is for Bitcoin. And so for the last 2.5 years, I've just said, guys, Bitcoin is a better hold than ETH because it gives you exposure to the upside. It minimizes your downside risk. It doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't go down. It just means that, what are you going to do? You're just going to, you're just going to twiddle your thumbs for 3 years? You're an investor, right? Theoretically, you have exposure to some part of the market. And if you have exposure into crypto, Bitcoin's going to be better than most other things until we get to looser monetary policy. That doesn't mean there's not going to be some alts that do well, and there have been. But in general, you're going to see dominance continue to slowly go higher, in my opinion. Now, dominance going higher is, one of these things that I don't think I'll ever talk about again, as I've said, after this cycle, because I just don't want to deal, honestly, with it, with the trolls and everything. And I'll tell you why. You basically, you'll see it pump, and then you kind of, you have that high because they're like, oh, okay, he was right about dominance. And then after you get that very short pump, it then like bleeds or does nothing for like 3 months straight. And then everyone's like, oh, he was wrong. And then it puts in a new high. Oh, that is right. And then it just goes down again for 3 months. Oh, he's wrong. It's just exhausting, right? It's really exhausting. And now you have another high, right? And now it's bleeding again. And now, obviously, once again, the DMs and the tweets and everything are people saying, all right, well, dominance is back down to 54%. He was wrong, right? Again, it's exhausting at some point. And I don't care to keep responding to the same thing over and over and over again, right? You either get it or you don't. As I've done my best to explain it over the last 2.5 years. And, despite the fact that dominance has just basically gone straight up, you still have people that don't believe it. You still have people that will tell you that ETH Bitcoin is holding up well, even though it's down like almost 50% from the highs. Okay. It's just, there's no way, right? They're going to say it's holding up well the entire way down on its Bitcoin pair. Did you know ETH has been red against Bitcoin 8 of the last 10 quarters, I believe? Look, 8 of the last 10 quarters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 10 total if you add these agreements. 8 of the last 10 quarters, it's been red. Again, it's not holding up well. It's bleeding. And I think that, there's this just reality of instead of it going quicker like it did last cycle, it's going a lot slower. So it's giving the illusion that it's holding up well. But then you look back on it and you're like, oh, well, I got hit. It was, 11% there, and then 1% down, and then 2% down, and then 13% down, and then 5% down, and then 6% down. And then before you know it, from the highs, it's down 46%, and people were saying it was holding up well the entire way down, right? You don't realize it because it's going so slow, but then you look back and you're like, oh, crap, it's just been going down. So I still think there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's sort of like a 2019 style thing. And again, that doesn't mean that you're not going to occasionally see it rally back up. We just saw it last week, actually. Last week we had a pretty nice rally back up, and I actually thought we were going to. We talked about, the most likely outcome in the short term is to take out that low from March. And then after you take it out, you then rally back up. And then you figure out what's what and who's who, right? But the most likely outcome was always go take out the low late April, early May. We literally drew this outcome out on Twitter and on YouTube. And then you go back up, and then you figure out what everything is, what's what and who's who. And that was why I said, when this happens, look to see what ETH Bitcoin does. But guys, I hate to tell you, but ETH Bitcoin's not doing well, even in the short term. It's just going down, suggesting that it's more 2019-esque. I think a lot of people were hoping that if Bitcoin came back down and then got a bounce back up, that ETH Bitcoin would do well, kind of like it did in late 2021. You guys remember that rally in late 2021 or mid 2021 in May? Bitcoin came down here in late April, and then it got a bounce, and then it topped out May 10th, right? ETH Bitcoin went crazy to the upside then. But during the very similar move, right, late April to May, you're seeing ETH Bitcoin go down. So that tells you that it's not 2021, right? It's not the 2021 rally. It's more similar to the 2019 rally, because after Bitcoin topped here, basically everything else did too. Right? It's not like ETH kept going up after Bitcoin topped. ETH kept going up after Bitcoin topped over here, right? If you overlay ETH USD onto this chart, look at this. 2019, when Bitcoin topped, so did ETH. 2021, when Bitcoin topped, ETH did not, right? It kept on going up. Now look at it over here, right? When Bitcoin topped, so did ETH. Again, it's still more similar to 2019 than it is 2021. And it's because of monetary policy, right? I mean, again, like it's not, this is just one of those things where like you know, when you have quantitative tightening, when Bitcoin tops, most everything else does too in the cryptoverse. When you have quantitative easing, when Bitcoin tops, that's when alt season is. So again, it's a very different setup than 2021. It's more similar to 2019. Now, again, one thing to think about though is that doesn't necessarily mean that the Bitcoin top is in. I think there's a good chance that that is a local top for a little while. Doesn't mean that it has to be. Even in 2019, we actually saw Bitcoin rally all the way until June, and it topped out 1 month before the first rate cut. And again, I mean, Bitcoin put in this top in March. We still haven't had a rate cut. We might not get one in June. So is there a chance that Bitcoin could rally again? It's possible, right? It's possible. The reason that I'm not super optimistic about that potential outcome is a few reasons. One is that, well, ETH Bitcoin already broke down and gold already broke out, right? So again, if you look at where ETH Bitcoin broke down in 2019, it was actually right here in right at that second top. Here it broke down, right around here. Kind of the same thing, right? Sort of a lower high second top. That's when ETH Bitcoin broke down. And then that's also where gold broke out in both cases. Gold broke out here in 2019, and then it also broke out right here in March of 2024. And so, I don't really know, like, does it still get another rally because we still are a little ways off from rate cuts, or does it just fade because there's not enough liquidity left because ETH Bitcoin already broke down? The reason I talk about ETH more than other cryptocurrencies is because it's much more closer to market cap to Bitcoin than any other cryptocurrency, and so it has more purchasing power, right? If you're converting your ETH to Bitcoin, it actually means something. If you're converting, your random 10,000th market cap altcoin to Bitcoin, it's not going to move the needle, right? So, I think that is something relevant to think about. And you could also find reasons why it could be similar to a 2023 type move as well, rather than a 2019 move. Sort of in the sense that, like, rather than fade, because back over here when Bitcoin topped, it faded about 50%, which is kind of what happened with ETH USD, right? Remember when ETH topped before the merge, it then fell almost 50%, right? Not quite, but I think it almost fell 50%. From this top right here down to that low. It was like a 45% drop or something. So yeah, there's a chance, right? There's definitely a chance that it could play out like that. And by the way, when Bitcoin did find that top, guess where it fell down to? Let's pretend like the pandemic isn't there. The pandemic gives you an idea of what a hard landing would look like, right? But if you look at moving averages for a 100-week SMA for Bitcoin, that is ultimately where Bitcoin fell back down to, was that 100-week moving average. Now, right now, the 100-week moving average is actually just around where we broke out from, okay? So that's what I would say a soft landing would look like. Again, a no landing would just be that this forms a higher low, and then we just keep going up, right? So a no landing is just a higher low, we keep going up. Soft landing would be, it fades back down. Hard landing would be goes below the 100-week SMA. But again, there's all sorts of outcomes that you can look at. One outcome is just, well, what if it's a repeat of last year and it's not 2019? Maybe the spot ETF stuff keeps it afloat more. And if you look at it like that, then you could find some examples where you get sort of an early top in the year followed by another top later on. So you have this 2013 top that occurred actually in April, right? So this was an April top. And then you had another top that occurred in November, right? Kind of reminds you of 2021, doesn't it? I mean, you had a top in April and a top in November, in fact. Very, very similar. And so what if this is the same, right? Where you get a top in April and then you get something else in November, right? Is there a chance that that plays out? Well, maybe some evidence for something like that is look at the 2-week RSI, okay? So just look at the 2-week relative strength index, and you'll see, in fact, that we did get really heat. I mean, people say, well, like, what evidence is there that we have to cool down? I mean, look at the 2-week RSI. I mean, I don't know if you guys are not looking at the same chart as I am, but every time it's hit this trend line before, it had a pretty large correction, right? In fact, after the 2-week RSI hit this trend line here in 2011, Bitcoin then fell 90-something%, right? When it hit it in 2013, I know it doesn't look like it, but it fell 80%. That might not look like a much back over there, 80%, but I mean, 80% down from right now would actually put Bitcoin at a new low. So I know these charts have a way of deceiving us because those moves back over there just look like nothing compared to what eventually happened. Just like what's happening now probably will look like nothing 10 years from now. But even after this, after this one, it dropped 80-something%. After this one, it dropped 80-something%, and then after this one, it actually went up a little bit more, and then it had a larger correction, right? So when you look at this, though, like, all right, well, what if it's like 2013? I mean, 2013 had a top in April, and then the 2-week RSI cooled all the way off back down to 56, right? Right now, the 2-week RSI is at around 70. So, what happens if it just cools all the way back down to in the 50s, and then maybe it picks back up? Kind of like it did over here. See, I think that my base case, as I've said for a long time, is that, in the short term, Bitcoin is between the 8-week SMA and the bull market support band. It's chopping around, and while it chops around, it takes that liquidity from the altcoin market. It just slowly absorbs it. And I know you're thinking, you're like, well, alts are doing okay against Bitcoin over the last couple of weeks. Yeah, guys, we talked about this, though. We said, look, once you get these wicks down, when they don't immediately continue lower, you then basically get another counter-trend rally for a few weeks. It can last for sometimes more than a month. I mean, over here we had one that lasted about a month, or actually it was about 6 weeks. I think we're currently in week 4, or this was about 6 weeks before it finally broke back down. And sometimes you get rallies that last even longer, right? Like this one, looks like there was a glitch here on this, but I mean, it lasted for about 3 months before then going and putting in a new low. So, I mean, like sometimes like that's what happens in the short term. You see the alts rally against Bitcoin for a little bit, but it doesn't mean anything, right? It still doesn't mean anything. And if you're curious, what could actually make them go down, I think the answer really lies in what happened in June of last year. You can also see it in 2019 as well. But when you look in June of last year, you will notice that if you overlay Bitcoin dominance onto this chart, you will see, in fact, and I got to go to the daily time frame for this to be actually observable, but you'll see that in 2023, I don't know if I said 2019, but in 2023, dominance started to go up aggressively before Bitcoin USD bottomed, right? You see that? Dominance was at 47.5. It had already gone up to 49 while Bitcoin USD was going down. But you can see what was happening at the time when that started to happen. So this is where we saw, basically Bitcoin dominance going up, but it was also because Bitcoin was breaking below this low over here, right? It was spending some more time down there. Right? So if you overlay, I don't know why I took it off, but if you overlay Bitcoin dominance, you can see that Bitcoin dominance started to really go up right here after Bitcoin USD was losing that low from way back over here in March. Okay? Now look at it in the current cycle. You have this low that was set in February that we've been trying to stay above. And as long as we're above it, I think alts are like, well, maybe the party's not over, right? I mean, can't we party on for a little bit? And if Bitcoin bounces, then maybe they do party on for a little bit longer. But if Bitcoin either aggressively moves higher, it rips altcoins a new one on their Bitcoin pairs, more than likely, or if Bitcoin goes below this, that's where we saw back over here, that's where we saw Bitcoin dominance start to really rally. And so you can already see it happening with ETH Bitcoin, right? You can really already see it. And, I've seen a lot of people say, well, last time after the halving, alts did pretty well. It's true, they did, but also ETH Bitcoin was already in an uptrend, right? I mean, the halving for Bitcoin occurred right around here, so it did mark some lows on ETH Bitcoin, and I'm not oblivious to that. I think, some people make these videos about me or these tweets about me, and they say, well, he's just, I'm not oblivious to that stuff, guys, right? I see that, but again, the same people that are saying that now about me, and I feel like being very unfair, they also said that ETH Bitcoin bottomed in January. And then before that, they said it bottomed in the summer of 2023, right? They just keep calling the bottom until they're right. And it's really frustrating for me because a lot of them, there's no accountability, right? There really isn't. They'll say the same thing over and over. They'll poke fun. And then when it turns out that they were wrong, then they just kind of re-say the same thing a few months later. And it's just exhausting, which is why I'm not doing it next cycle. But yes, they did well after the halving. ETH Bitcoin was also in an uptrend. ETH Bitcoin was in an uptrend because the Fed had already pivoted. So again, that's kind of why I think, it's not like a clear comparison to the halving year, because if it were, then you would have expected ETH Bitcoin to be going up this year, but it's not. So, I mean, that's pretty much where we are, with all this dubious speculation. I mean, the short term, I would expect Bitcoin to hold up better than most other cryptocurrencies. Where it could become an issue for alts, one of two things. If Bitcoin gets a big rally back up to the 8-week SMA, you're likely going to see alt Bitcoin pairs bleed. If Bitcoin goes below this level, if it starts really going below this level, or even this one, then that's where alts could really start to show that weakness again, because then they start to then question, wait, is Bitcoin done for a little while? Like, why is there no alt season? Because a lot of times when Bitcoin puts in new highs, that's what happens. There's a rotation into alts. So that's why if Bitcoin gets too close to these lows, those alts might start to second guess themselves and think like, oh, well, if Bitcoin can't go up and the people that are holding Bitcoin are not converting into alts, then that's when alts can sell off aggressively. So I think it's all worthwhile, to think about. And it's been a long journey for sure. I mean, right now the bull market support band for Bitcoin is 55. Let me go over to the weekly. 56.7K to 57K. Basically 57K is where the bull market support band is. So, if we fade back down there, I keep an eye on that. Also, one thing to think about with 2019, what actually happened, and I actually pointed this out previously, and I'd like to follow up on it. After Bitcoin USD took out this low, right? You see that low that it took out? It then put in a low, and then it bounced, and then it came right back down, and then hit that same level again. And then it got a larger bounce, so it still was a lower high, but that's ultimately what happened. It was during this bounce that ETH Bitcoin got absolutely annihilated. That actually corresponded to rate cuts. Now, if that's going to play out again, you can see that Bitcoin USD had this rally, right? And well, first of all, it took out that low, and then it had a rally, and then it's coming back down. If it comes back down to this level and then bounces, then it is very similar to 2019, right? And if it does bounce and ETH Bitcoin drops a lot, then what more proof do you need that it's very similar to 2019? So I would definitely keep an eye on this. Now, remember, the last time the larger bounce occurred when rate cuts occurred. And if you look at these like lower highs, we haven't even really tagged that trend line again. I mean, to tag that trend line, you'd actually have to go up quite a bit depending on when you hit it. Or maybe if you ignore that one and you just say, look at these sort of like that, it wouldn't have to be at quite as high. But you know, the problem is like we're probably not going to get a rate cut immediately. Maybe you get one in June, but in order to get one in June, you're going to have some really bad labor market print. And today we just got inflation stuff out, sort of inflation expectations, and it wasn't good, meaning that, you know, people are expecting higher inflation. So it's sort of like stagflation, right? You just don't, you know, it's not going away, but there's not really, you know, it's just a difficult part of the cycle, right? I mean, I think everyone feels kind of miserable to some degree because of how expensive everything in life has become. And I think like people really want to see looser monetary policy so that we can, you know, breathe a little bit easier, and we're not like, you know, not everyone's like suffocating from, you know, 7.5% mortgage rates. And again, I mean, in the grand scheme of history, 7.5% is nothing for a 30-year fixed mortgage. But it's not about like, it's more about the rate of change, right? If you go from basically 2.5% to 3% and you go to 7.5% within a couple of years, that's what hurts. It's not the absolute number. It's what people are used to. And I think that's been really hard on people. It's lasted a lot longer than they thought it would. And this is what I warned about, right? Higher for longer, 5.5% Fed funds rate, when most people said it wouldn't go above 3.5%. So remember, you know, yes, some alts have done well, but they only have done well because Bitcoin has done well. And if Bitcoin stops doing well, then again, like 2019, then alts stop doing well. So I think that is still a relevant comparison. I really do. And I know people don't like it and they say, well, no, it's up because of this. But you have to remember that almost every single one of these people that hold these views about alts, they told you Bitcoin dominance stopped last year, right? So they did well in some of the alts, but they probably would have been better off with Bitcoin in most cases. I mean, it's not like if you bought ETH at $2,000, you're hurting right now. It's just that you could have bought Bitcoin and you could have been up more, right? That's why I talk about like opportunity cost a lot. One thing to look for, because this is what happened in 2019, and I don't know if it's going to happen, but this is what I think you should look at. In 2019, what essentially happened is Bitcoin stayed above its bull market support band, but on one of these dumps, ETH got below it, right? So if you go look at ETH USD back over here, right? So if we go look at it in 2019, you can see that it actually fell below it, had a weekly close below it in July. Now, when it had that weekly close below it, it was on this pullback by Bitcoin, right? You see that pullback? And it was sort of that double bottom at that low, right? So we were just talking about this where Bitcoin USD it took out this area, it took out that low from over here, and then it put in a low and then put in a double bottom. When it put in that double bottom, ETH USD got pinned below its bull market support band while Bitcoin was still above it. So Bitcoin had the freedom to rally because it was still above its bull market support band, but ETH USD did not because it was already pinned below it. So then ETH USD found resistance at its bull market support band, right? Where Bitcoin got a bounce off of it. And during that rally, that is where ETH Bitcoin got absolutely annihilated. Right there. That 2-week rally. You don't believe me? Go look at it, right? I mean, this was July 29th and August 5th. Those 2 weeks. Go look at ETH Bitcoin the week of July 29th and August 5th of 2019, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Right here. July 22nd, here's July 29th, ETH Bitcoin went down 8.5%. And then the following week, it went down 7.5%. You had 2 weeks where it dropped from 0.022 to 0.017. That's a big drop, right? I mean, it might not sound like a lot, but I mean, the wick down actually was 20% down. To give you an idea of what that would look like today, that would be from the current levels, a 20% drop would put you at 0.038, right? So I think it makes sense to look at this and say, guys, it might be 2019-esque. It very well could be. And, you know, when I say that, I'm not saying that it has to, you know, everything. I mean, 2019 was not down only by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't. It kept people second guessing for months before it actually fell below the bull market support band. For months. I mean, this whole process here lasted from June. I mean, this until you fell below it. It was 13 weeks. I mean, to give you an idea of where that would put you, from here, we're only in week 8. I mean, 13 weeks puts you out in June. You know why June is fascinating? Do you know why June is fascinating? It's because when you look at dominance of Bitcoin excluding stables, it normally finds a top in June. And you might say, well, why does that matter for Bitcoin and the 20-week SMA? It's a great question, right? The reason why it matters is because if you remember last cycle, dominance topped before Bitcoin fell below the bull market support band, right? It topped before that. So this is saying, well, if it takes 13 weeks to fall below it, and you're now looking at it over here, and you're like, well, we're only in week 8. When does 13 weeks happen? It happens in June of 2024. So you could get an example where Bitcoin gets occasional drops, occasional rallies, stays above the bull market support band, and while it does, ETH Bitcoin goes down, alt Bitcoin pairs go down, and then Bitcoin dominance tops in June or July, right? It could theoretically be later. There are some pieces of evidence to suggest it could take a little bit longer because everything else has taken longer this cycle. So I don't want to say definitively it has to be June. There's also sometimes where dominance doesn't shift until September. And actually in 2019, Bitcoin dominance topped in September. But September for me, I mean, that's still summertime, right? I mean, so I think dominance will top this summer, either June, July, I mean, it could be as late as September. But somewhere between June to September is most likely the Bitcoin dominance top, in my opinion. But the reason why this is interesting in terms of a timing perspective is 13 weeks. That would be June before potentially falling below the bull market support band. And the reason why that's interesting is because if that is the case, just remember the last, when we're looking at Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoin tops, it tends to find a local top either in June or July, right? It actually was June and then July and then June and then a local top in June. We had another rally later on, but you can kind of see it going back up over here. So again, that's where we are, and I've provided the evidence for it. If we make it all the way through the summer without falling below the bull market support band, then it's perhaps not exactly like 2019, right? If we're out, if it's October and we're still above it, then it's different. But if it just, bounces around like this and then falls below this summer, right? Actually, I have a forecast for it. So here's the bull market support band forecast based on a constant 20-week SMA or constant price, right? So if it does something like this, where it comes down and bounces up and then comes like that, and then eventually it falls below, you could have a scenario where dominance is topping somewhere over here, and then after dominance tops, then Bitcoin goes down. Everyone's like, oh, great, it's time to buy alts because Bitcoin dominance is top. But then while all Bitcoin pairs go up, Bitcoin USD could be going down for a while. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that, it has to be 2019, but it could just be that it goes down until QE returns, right? And who knows how long that's going to be. But that is definitely one outcome I think to consider. And one of the reasons I talk about this is because I think it's more dependent on monetary policy than people think. The people that say that it's not dependent on it will have told you dominance stopped long ago. I think it really does depend on monetary policy. And I also think that, almost everyone else is only ever calling for much higher prices. I think it's worthwhile to say, it could happen. I do own Bitcoin, believe it or not, right? It could happen. And so Bitcoin gives you the exposure if you want it, right? But guess what? If Bitcoin bounces around in here and doesn't put in new highs, it's going to be obvious, right? If all Bitcoin pairs just keep on bleeding while Bitcoin's bouncing around, it should be obvious that it's more like 2019, because that's what 2019 was. It was just bouncing around. And we stayed above 10K for months. And everyone believed we were going to stay above it forever. And people were like, oh, never again are we going to go below 10K. And then we did. And you know why? It was because liquidity from alts had dried up. So I'd be careful with the with the 2021 narrative. I do think the most similar is 2019. The funny thing about it is that you could have an example where you even get a higher high and it still be comparable to 2019. I mean, even last year, we had a rally in June that just swept the high, I mean, and then it just came right back down. I remember saying, okay, we're going to get a summer lull. And we did. And everyone's like, all right, he was right. And then we had a big move up. And they're like, oh, what happened to the summer lull, right? And then it just came back down again. So you could have examples like that. I do think that, you have two very clear examples where, here you faded and then you popped. Here you faded and then you dropped. And, when it popped over here, it was before ETH Bitcoin had broken down. That was before gold had broken out. When you dropped over here, it was after ETH Bitcoin had broken down. It was after gold had broken out. So I think the most fair comparison is 2019. I think the next fair comparison is 2023. I feel like the least fair comparison is this. Because while it's at a similar price, so there's some comparison. I think it's the least fair, the least reasonable, because over here, Bitcoin dominance was in a massive downtrend. Here, Bitcoin dominance is in a massive uptrend, right? So there's two, it's clearly not that. So, but you could make the case that it's 2019. You could make the case that it's 2023. You could try to make the case that it's this, but or even this, right? I mean, there's been some people that have said, well, maybe this is just sort of this last fade before you pop up one last time before something crazy. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know about that. I think the most fair comparison is 2019. Right, which if that is the fair comparison, you still have a little bit of chopping around to do for a few more weeks, just so Bitcoin can really take that liquidity from the altcoin market. The reason why you could compare it over here is because this is the same cycle, right? I mean, like it's possible. It's possible to compare it to this. Bitcoin dominance was in an uptrend over here too, and maybe it doesn't have to be as bad as 2019 because you have the spot ETFs. I think that's a little bit Cope-esque. I feel like I remember in 2021, everyone's like, oh, this time is different. You have MicroStrategy and everyone else, but it wasn't. This feels, again, but I mean, at the end of the day, you do have a lot more institutions buying Bitcoin over here than you ever had in 2019. That doesn't mean you can't drop. It doesn't mean you can't drop some. But markets sort of adapt and evolve over time. So most fair comparison 2019, second fairest 2023, least fairest over here is 2020 and 2021 because this was QE and a Bitcoin dominance downtrend. These were QT. This was QT. This was QT in a Bitcoin dominance uptrend. And actually, if you look at it, it actually played out very similar. If you look at interest rates on this chart, actually, when you look at interest rates right here, you can see that when the Fed hit the terminal rate, Bitcoin sold off and then rallied, right? Now look at it over here. When the Fed hit the terminal rate, look what happened. Bitcoin sold off and then rallied. Right? It's very, very similar. Very similar. I think that just the real question is like, is there another rally into the summer? I already talked about this earlier, so I feel like it's just getting repetitive, right? But I've gone back and forth a lot on it because I want people to know at all times that markets can do anything, right? And the S&P is not even that far away from putting in a new high. I have looked at the S&P compared to sort of this correction over here. If you look at sort of a fib retracement on this, you can see that. Well, I guess I was actually taking it all the way back down here, but you can see it got pretty close back to the highs before it ultimately let me actually just take it from right here to that. Yeah, so it looks like it rallied up to about the 786 almost. Yeah, it's gone a little bit above that now. So, I mean, with the S&P, pushing near new highs, it's not like it's impossible for Bitcoin to do the same. But I also know too that even in 2019, the S&P did put in new highs, and it was actually sort of this choppy price action over here. Bitcoin topped out right, like right here. That's where Bitcoin topped out. Um, so, I don't know if Bitcoin can see sort of one final push or not. Um, but I think that even if it does, it still is similar to 2019, right? Even if you put in a new high, I don't see how it's not similar, because even in 2019, you still had a high in June, and then you still faded into the back half of the year. So, I don't know. I really don't. I don't know if it's going to get another high or not. I think that with ETH, Bitcoin breaking down and gold breaking out, there's reason to believe that it might not. Um, I don't want to say that with too much strong conviction, because back over here in April of 2023, I would have said, all right, it's gonna fade into the summer, and then it did. And I was like, oh yeah, see, April was the top, and then we just went up and swept the high, right? So you could see something like that. And by the way, you could get an example where you get close to sweeping the high, but you don't actually get there, because when the Fed cut rates last cycle, you did see a pretty big rally back up to this trend line that we hadn't tested in a little while, right? Because we hit this trend line in June, and then July, and then again in August. So far, we've just hit this trend line in March and April, right? So you could always get an example where you go back up and you go near the high, but you don't actually take it out. That's really what happened in 2019, is right. You got a pretty big bounce into the first rate cut, but it didn't actually take out the prior high. So I think that the one thing I've learned is every single time I have said a summer lull is likely going to happen, I've always regretted it at some point, because there's always like a 2-week period where you're like, oh crap, what if it's not, right? And in last year, it was this period, right, where I was like, oh crap, I said summer lull, and then it got this rally, and everyone's gonna be mad, and then it just faded back down. And the year before, I said, all right, summer lull, and then in July 2022, we had this rally, and everyone was mad again. Even over here, I called for a summer lull. In April, I put out a video saying we're probably gonna get a summer lull, I think, and then we had this 2-week rally. I was like, oh crap! And it was really toxic back then too, because everyone was in FOMO mode. And then we had this 2-week rally, and I was like, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. And even in 2019, you had, I mean, this was a lot later in the summer. This was in July, but you still had a 2-week rally where you're like, oh, what if this is not the top? So at any given point, if you call, or if I say, all right, I think there's going to be a summer lull, it's not like it means down only, right? It's not like it just means it's going to go straight down, but there will probably come a point where you get some type of mean reversion back up to the upside that's a little bit more durable than this. And I mean, it could occur from a lower price, right? I mean, you could come down here and then get a rally like that. But whenever that happens, I know people are going to say, well, you said summer lull. Guys, it's a market. It moves stochastically. It doesn't just go up in a straight line. It doesn't go down in a straight line. In fact, you could argue that for the sake of Bitcoin dominance at some point, whether it's, at this low down here or at 60K, at some point, hopefully it does see a little bit of relief, because it's during those relief periods where alts break down on their Bitcoin pairs. Now, there also are examples where they break down on their Bitcoin pairs on dumps, and that's actually something that we don't actually see that often, but it actually just happened. This drop right here by alt Bitcoin pairs in the week of April 8th actually occurred on a Bitcoin drop rather than a Bitcoin pump. And that is something that you don't see that often, but when it does happen, it should get your attention. Because most of these times where you get these wicks, like right here, it's on a Bitcoin rally. Right here, it's on a Bitcoin rally. Even sort of, even these wicks over here, right? There a lot of times are on Bitcoin rallies. I remember the one at least in July, right? This one in July, all Bitcoin pairs were cratering, and it was on a Bitcoin rally. So usually when all Bitcoin pairs are breaking down, it's on a Bitcoin rally, but sometimes like 2022, right, you had all Bitcoin pairs breaking down on a Bitcoin dump. So that is something to take note, is that, you know, normally all Bitcoin pairs break down on a Bitcoin rally, but here you actually had them breaking down on a Bitcoin dump. So if something like that happens and you don't get a relief rally and Bitcoin just dumps, then the reason why alt Bitcoin pairs might go down is because, like, oh crap, you know, if Bitcoin's throwing in the towel, then we have to as well. But I think in the short term, which is obviously impossible to predict, I think in the short term, Bitcoin is just going to keep on chopping around between the bull market support band and the 8-week moving average. And that chopping price action should lead to Bitcoin dominance going higher, slowly but surely. I know today it's at 54% or wherever it is, 54.6, where is it? 54.7, right? But if you think about it, it's still above the 8-week SMA. You know, I mean, it's still above the average of the last 8 weeks, so get off my back. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.